Mummy's Boy by Robert Eastland, read by Lesley Grantham.
When I looked over the big back gates, I could not believe what I was seeing. I almost swooned, in fact. When I had moved away from Highbury some 2 years ago, this had been a tall, semi-detached townhouse, but now they had changed it. They had changed it all. It was built on a slope, so while the front door opened onto the street, the back door had been at the top of a flight of wrought iron stairs, which had dropped nearly 10 feet to a strip of lawn and a cobbled drive connecting to the residents-only access road. The garage had been on that level, integral to the house, but located beneath everything else. That was how it had been, as I say, and now they had changed it all. The cobbled drive had been turfed over, and where the garage had once been, a new extension had been built. The back door was now on ground level, and through a wide, fashionably mullioned window, I could see that a kitchen occupied the spot where I'd once housed my car. I couldn't imagine what Brenda was going to say. I was so shaken, in fact, that at first I didn't notice the young woman approaching tentatively along the access road. When I did see her, I apologized and stepped back. She was carrying shopping bags, and apparently it was this particular pair of gates she wanted to pass through. She looked warily at me as she shut the gates behind her. Suddenly there was a light of recognition in her face. Aren't you... Yes, I said awkwardly. I sold you the house 2 years ago. She half smiled, and we stood in difficult silence for a moment. Eventually she asked if I was all right. She said I looked a little pale. I assured her I was fine, but wondered when they had had the extension put in. Oh, it's not been finished long, she said brightly. In fact, the last skipful of rubble was only removed yesterday. She paused uncertainly. I take it you don't approve. Oh, no, I said. No, it's nice. How far back does it go? Into the garage, I mean. Oh, we've taken up the whole garage, she said. We've completely redeveloped. Even had to tear some of the old foundation walls out. Indeed. I could feel my legs shaking, could sense the colour draining out of my face. Again, she asked me if I was all right. I looked up at her. She was quite attractive in a plum-voiced, well-heeled sort of way. For a moment, I wondered what it would be like knocking her out, then wrapping her up like a parcel in sticking plaster and limp bandages. Do you know, it's the oddest thing, she suddenly declared. I waited tensely. You might be able to explain it. We found an old wardrobe bricked up in one of the garage walls. I tried to say something but couldn't. All bricked over, she went on. At first we thought it'd been there for years, but our builder said it hadn't. There was nothing in it, of course. Nothing in it. Hard though I tried, I couldn't keep the shock out of my voice, and she jumped violently. No, she said, a little shaken. Of course it was lying in the rubble for a few days before we actually got round to looking in it. We'd moved out for a week, you see. I nodded and smiled, my mind racing ahead of me. What? I shrugged and made some meaningless gesture. Oh, what an odd thing. A wardrobe. So what did you do with it? She looked thoughtful. Do you know, it was still quite solid, so I think we gave it to the Stoke Newington Mothers' Union, of all the ridiculous things. I looked at her askance. Stoke Newington's Mothers' Union? She nodded, for a raffle. Unable to help myself, I howled with laughter. I howled with laughter all the way back along the access road as the woman stared after me, astonished. That was just so neat. I couldn't have scripted it better. I was still chuckling by the time I reached the tube station, but now more with hysteria than mirth. I couldn't even stop my hands shaking. For one thing, what the hell had happened to the contents of the wardrobe? For another, what was Brenda going to say when she found out that I'd been back over there again? I could hear her nagging even then as I checked my underground travel card and walked down to the platforms. Why do you keep going back, she'd be saying over her fourth Pims. Can't you forget her, for God's sake? You're supposed to be a grown man now. Do you want to get us both locked up? As I stood alone on the southbound platform, I wondered at the answers to those questions myself. It was certainly a hard one. But then, when two women insist on making it one or the other, what can you do? And when one treats you to one of her famous long, cold silences, then when she finally does speak, threatens to cut you off without a penny, and you haven't a skill to your name. And the other might not be able to cook very well or do the ironing to military camp precision, but is still blonde and bosomy and a heck of a lot younger. Well, it's still not an easy decision, though. Little wonder I hadn't actually been able to do the dirty. No, I'd never have been able to bring myself to do that. Of course, what I had resorted to had more or less added up to the same thing. I'd thought. I wondered again about the wardrobe lying open and empty in the demolition rubbish. It made me a little uneasy. The arched tunnels at either end of the curved platform were filled with darkness, and not another soul was in sight. In addition to this, it seemed eerily quiet for an underground station in mid-morning. That was when I first heard the rustling sound. I listened to it intently for a moment, and then sniggered. Just for a second then I'd imagined, but no, probably just old newspapers blowing about in an air vent. It wasn't going away, however, that rustling sound. In fact, it seemed to be getting louder, and it didn't sound much like paper either, more like rags or bandages. Stiff, stinking, rotted bandages. I tried to tell myself this was foolish, but glanced nervously behind me all the same. The exit passage swung out of sight, but I knew that at the far end of it, steep stairs ran up to the higher levels, and I could have sworn that the rustling sound, or whatever was causing it, was shuffling painfully down that way, towards my platform. Absurdly, I began to back away. All of a sudden, the sound seemed intolerably loud, and it was getting louder, without any doubt. At any second, I expected the sound maker to stumble into view, turning blindly and limping straight towards me. It was nonsense, I told myself, still retreating. It would be some bag lady. That would explain the smell too, the sour, cloying smell now wafting about me. I looked wildly around for someone, but nobody was there. Hanging in a metal box over the lines was a glowing red message. The next train, Brixton, 4 minutes. 4 minutes? That was no good. That was no good at all. I began to stride down the platform as quickly as I was able, determined not to run. But I felt, rather than saw, the spindly figure emerge behind me, and then I couldn't help it. I started to sprint, headlong. Fleeting thoughts struck me about what I would do when I reached the end, and did I dare venture into the tunnel the way they did on films, when mercifully another exit materialized beside me, and I ducked quickly through it, staggering up a narrow stair into a crossroads of tunnels, where suddenly there were numerous other people about. I re-emerged on Canterbury Road only seconds later, my brow beaded with sweat. I walked unsteadily away for another 3 or 4 minutes before stopping to get my thoughts in order. It was the shock of seeing the house, of course. Delayed shock. I began to walk on again. Easy to explain. That was when I became aware that someone was stalking me. For 50 yards along the pavement, plywood hoardings had been nailed up to wall off an area of rubble and rebuilding. The narrowest gaps were visible between each section, and it was through these that I suddenly noticed a figure keeping abreast of me. I couldn't make it out, but with each gap I passed, a shadow flickered by on the other side. There was also that rather unpleasant odour as well. I halted in my tracks and listened. Only the raucous sounds of the London streets came back to me. In such a cacophony of noise, it was almost impossible to hear anything out of the ordinary. But I could have sworn that something was on the other side of the hoarding from me, not moving. I started, then hurriedly crossed the road and hailed a black cab. I climbed into it immediately and ordered the driver to take me to Little Venice. I didn't specify the address. Benefiting from the sale of an unmortgaged house in central London teaches you to be cautious like that. The cab pulled quickly away from the curb, and I gazed out of the window behind us, hoping to catch some glimpse of the thing which had followed me. The hoardings continued to the next corner, and just as we drew away from it, I saw an old man in a shabby raincoat emerge. He was zipping up his flies. I sat back, still sweating hard. It hadn't made me feel any better. Countless minutes passed as I wrestled my ridiculous fears. How was I going to explain all this to Brenda? I just didn't know. Even if she did believe me, and didn't insist I'd been off mooning about and daydreaming again, she'd probably drag me by the collar back to every place I imagined I'd been frightened in, and insist on proving to me there was nothing there. I wasn't sure if I could face that. That was when I noticed something peculiar about the cabbie. Everything had at first appeared normal. The meter was running, a copy of the Sun was folded on the dashboard, but he hadn't once looked round or spoken. He wore a heavy overcoat as well, a thick, heavy overcoat on a hot summer day. Too mesmerised to exercise caution, I craned my neck forwards to look at the hands clamped on the steering wheel. They were swathed in ragged, dirty stuff, every finger separately wrapped. I left my seat with such force that the cab's door literally exploded open in front of me. Before I knew what was happening, I was staggering away across some parkland, then down a side street. I'd just had time to hear angry shouting in a bass Cockney voice somewhere behind me, but I must have covered half a mile before it began to dawn on me that the cabbie had in fact been wearing dirty woolen mittens, probably serving as driving gloves. Red-faced and feeling extremely guilty, I made the rest of the way to Little Venice on foot. It was lunchtime by the time I reached the flat, and despite the terrors of the morning, a real hunger had come over me. It was rapture to finally get inside and lock the door behind me, and then be assailed by delicious smells from the kitchen. I could hear Brenda working in there, and hurried through, stripping off my jacket, and telling her how hungry I was. I still wasn't sure how to broach the subject of the wardrobe, but safe in my castle again, I was certain I'd think of something. I was so preoccupied with this that I didn't immediately notice the object propped up in the corner of the closet. I was just in the process of hanging up my jacket when I saw it. My jaw locked open. It was essentially a human figure, but plastered from head to foot in bandages, now yellow and black and hanging down in tattered strips. A charnel reek came off it, and vermin visibly writhed in its loose and rotten folds. It did not move, however, and was plumper than I'd expected it to be. In fact, it was rather shapely. Then I noticed a fresh crimson stain soaked in over the facial area, and the strands of long blonde hair straggling down from the hastily wrapped head. I backed slowly away and found myself falling into a seat by the kitchen table. My lunch had already been cooked and was waiting there for me. No TV dinner today, however, but 4 rashers of bacon, Cumberland sausage, 2 fried eggs and a heap of crisp golden chips. My favourite lunchtime meal, apparently done to a turn. The eggs were just the way I'd always liked them too, sunny side up. In fact, the only thing missing was vinegar. I couldn't have chips without vinegar. As though sensing my disappointment, somebody came up and banged down a bottle of vinegar next to the plate. It hit the tabletop so hard that some of the fluid spat out of the nozzle and hit me in the eye, stinging badly. I wiped it out, but said nothing. It looked like I was in for another of those long, cold silences, I thought, as I tucked in.